Good evening. Thank you for joining us here in Roswell. Our next speaker is UK-born Nick Redfern. He's the author of several important and well-known books in the field of ufology, including Strange Secrets, A Covert Agenda, and Cosmic Crashes, all books documenting government records of UFO activity. He has worked as a freelance journalist for the London Daily Express and is a feature writer for the London-based People, and too many newsstand publications within the UK to name here. Most recently, he writes for UFO Magazine and just completed publication of his newest book, Celebrity Secrets, detailing FBI surveillance files on many of Hollywood's best-known personalities. Recently, however, he also authored Body Snatchers in the Desert, The Horrible Truth Behind the Roswell Incident, and On the Trail of the Saucer Spies, which documents government surveillance of people within the field of ufology. Today he shares with us, perhaps, the most amazing and, if true, quite grisly alternative explanation of what might really have happened in Roswell of 1947. Please welcome Nick Redfern.
I'll pay you for that nice introduction later. Well, thanks everybody. I guess we've heard a lot of good speakers so far, but I guess for every good guy you have to have the bad guy, and for this conference I guess the bad guy is me. And as Lisa said, what I'm going to be speaking about is my book, Body Snatchers in the Desert. If I can get rid of that security sensor thing. And as Lisa briefly said, Body Snatchers in the Desert is based around Roswell, but it looks at the case, if you like, the incident, the aftermath, the whole history of it from a completely different perspective. That being, is it possible that yes, some sort of unconventional vehicle or vehicles crashed, bodies were recovered, but they were distinctly not alien? Now, I guess from the UFO community's perspective at least, when the book was published in June 2005, all hell metaphorically broke loose in terms of, how could this man dare say this about this one particular case that, is the holy grail, if you like, of ufology. And, I've seen a lot of things where I've been painted as not just a skeptic, but an outright debunker, or the worst thing from, a combination of Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. And almost, shall we say. Not quite, but it was almost down that path, shall we say. Which is actually quite far from the case. And as I've got sort of 90 minutes rather than the normal hour that I do on this lecture normally, I sort of share a bit of background with you on not just the story, but how I came to uncover the story and the basic bones of it. As far as my ufological beliefs are concerned, if you like, at a collective level, I'm not a skeptic, I'm not a debunker. The reason I got interested and how I got interested is that my father served in the British Royal Air Force and worked on radar. In the early 1950s, he was stationed at a base in the east coast of England called RAF Neatishead. And he was on duty one night in the early hours of the morning, tracking these weird objects flying from the former Soviet Union, or the region of the former Soviet Union. And of course, the first thought was this was some sort of sneak Russian attack. And aircraft were scrambled from a nearby Air Force base. Pilots reported seeing these weird glowing lights in the sky, didn't know what they were. The pilots were ordered to try and close in on them. And the objects actually slowed down and allowed the aircraft to close in. And it was almost like a game of cat and mouse was being played between the air crews and the UFOs. And this went on literally over the course of about 3 nights. And eventually everybody involved in the incident was taken into a room, sworn to secrecy, reminded of the fact that they'd signed the British government's Official Secrets Act, and told, you won't talk to your family, friends, and you certainly won't talk to the media about this incident. And my father did keep quiet about this and didn't relate the facts to anybody until roughly around, I think, 1978, 79, when he told me. And that's what really got my interest. And of course, when you hear something like this from a family member, a story of sort of profound significance from someone who's trained to know what goes on in our skies, that really opened my eyes to the fact that, yes, strange things are out there. So, I'm certainly not a UFO skeptic. And I was talking to Michael earlier. I think one of the problems with Roswell is that it's one of these make or break cases where if it's proven to be extraterrestrial, then, the game's over and we know the truth. But I think the problem with Roswell is that it's been built up particularly by the media, but also by the UFO research community, as the one case that will answer the question. And in one respect, that's true. But on the other hand, it's almost like if Roswell collapses, then the extraterrestrial hypothesis for the UFO subject, or indeed, the idea that there's an unexplained angle to it, that collapses as well. And that shouldn't actually be the case. If you look at, for example, the collective body of information that we have in hand on UFO reports from the mid-40s onwards to the present day, there's a significant body of reports, literally thousands, radar cases, visual cases, pilot reports, police reports, members of the public, official documents from the CIA, FBI, National Security Agency, which, when you combine them, convincingly, for me at least, show that something strange is flying around our skies. And I certainly don't believe the vast majority of the unexplained ones are some sort of classified government technology. I think we do have some sort of unknown presence amongst us. I'm just, not prepared to say it's from planet A or it's from star system B, because I think if we're honest with ourselves, none of us have those answers to a definitive point. So that's basically my position. But I think that, as I said, as far as Roswell's concerned, we don't need to, or we shouldn't, make that one particular case as the emphasis upon which the extraterrestrial hypothesis stands. And unfortunately, consciously or subconsciously or unconsciously, that does happen. If one case collapses, so what? There's another 3,999 that still stand the test of time. So with that little bit of background, I guess, out of the way, I'll sort of get into the body of what the book's about and how I uncovered the story, and do I consider it to be true? Do I consider the people I interviewed to be truthful, but were they deceived? Or is the whole thing disinformation to hide the fact that aliens really did crash at Roswell? And that's basically the theme of the lecture. Now, the story behind the book is that I interviewed a number of ex-military and intelligence people between 1996 and 2004 who broadly related from their own perspectives a story that suggested that in the New Mexico desert in the summer of 1947, a number of experiments and test flights were undertaken on prototype aircraft which had guinea pig crews on board, if crew is the right word. Some of these were high-altitude balloon experiments to try and determine the effects of high-altitude exposure on the human body, which actually wasn't that well understood at that particular time in history. Other ones were prototype flights of radically designed aircraft, swept-wing aircraft, half-moon type vehicles. And the story I got was that a number of these tests, experiments were undertaken. Pretty much all of them didn't really work that well. They crashed, the crews were killed, the bodies were recovered, and the whole thing was hidden behind a UFO smokescreen. That's, in a nutshell, the story. It actually goes back to 1996 for me, but the beginnings of it, in recent years at least, go back to 1991. And one of the things I'm going to mention tonight is certain things that aren't in the book. The way the publisher wanted me to write the book was not from a personal perspective. They just wanted the text of the interviews with the people that I'd done, transcribing the tapes and the interview notes, etc., and me present that for the reader, which I had no problem with. But they didn't want it from a sort of personal, first-hand perspective of how I got the information, which I think, had that been included, that might have kind of, I won't say convince people more, that's the wrong word, but I think it would have made people realise why I continue to pursue this story. Well, as everybody knows, there have been countless witnesses to Roswell have come forward throughout the years, pretty much going back to Jesse Marcel Sr., Major Marcel, who pretty much was responsible for breaking the story in the modern era when he was tracked down by Stanton Friedman. And then people like Bill Moore and Charles Berlitz wrote the Roswell incident, and then Kevin Randall and Don Schmitt followed that up. And, subsequently to where now, I think there's probably been somewhere in the region of about 20 books published on Roswell. Well, in 1991, a British author named Timothy Good published a book called Alien Liaison. And Alien Liaison included the testimony of a man who was stationed at Roswell named Melvin Brown. And Brown said that he'd seen some of the bodies that had been recovered from the New Mexico desert in the summer of 1947. And his exact words were that they could have passed for Chinese. Now, this at the time didn't really, it wasn't a matter of any significance, shall we say. A number of people have said that the bodies found at Roswell had sort of slanted eyes or oriental eyes. So that kind of tied in there. But the fact that he specifically said they could have passed for Chinese, that was sort of another angle. It almost sounded like, passing for Chinese was almost identical. Coincidentally or not, in the same year, 1991, an American researcher named Leonard Stringfield published a status report. He put out these regular status reports on his research into crashed UFOs, which he began in 1978, and his last one was in 1994, the year that he died. And in his 1991 report, he put out a story, or a number of stories, included in the book, from a researcher named Timothy Cooper. And Tim Cooper was one of the early researchers of the Majestic 12 documents, these leaked whistleblower documents that suggest aliens did crash at Roswell and that this clandestine group called Majestic 12 was established to deal with the crash and the aftermath and autopsies of the alien bodies, etc. Well, one of the stories that Cooper got hold of and that Stringfield published in 1991 was a story from a nurse who worked at Los Alamos in the summer of 1947. And she had told Cooper, indirectly or directly, we're not sure if there was an intermediary between Cooper and the nurse. That's still a bit of a grey area. But the gist of the story was that the nurse worked at Los Alamos and she was aware of, I think between 1945 and 1947, a number of strange-looking bodies having been brought into Los Alamos. And the rumour mill that was going around Los Alamos, it was that they were deformed, handicapped people brought in from Japan at the end of the Second World War for use in early radiation experiments at Los Alamos. So you have two strands of what could be one story. You have Melvin Brown in Timothy Good's book talking about how he'd seen these bodies at Roswell that could have passed for Chinese people. Then you have Timothy Cooper's nurse talking about seeing these deformed bodies at Los Alamos that were rumoured to be Japanese people used in radiation experiments. Now, again, that's just two stories. There's nothing to tie those in. Well, then in 1997, Popular Mechanics, which is a well-known newsstand magazine, published a story. Now, I'm sure a lot of you who have followed the Roswell story will know the angle that surfaced in 1997 from the US Air Force when they announced that the stories about so-called alien bodies being found at Roswell were just crash test dummies used in high-altitude parachute experiments. That was the official story that was put out. However, a couple of months before that story surfaced, Popular Mechanics published their own story saying that they'd specifically been told of a forthcoming release of documents that would actually finally explain the body's angle of what was found at Roswell. And they said that they'd been told that what it would prove, or what it would show, was that there was a secret trade-off between the US and the Japanese at the end of the Second World War to secretly transfer a number of Japanese scientists and Japanese technology to the United States in the same way that various German scientists were brought over with Operation Paperclip, which is a legitimate historical project. With Paperclip, German V-2 rockets were brought over and tested in the New Mexico desert, and the scenario presented by Popular Mechanics was that something similar was done with the Japanese, but it was somehow tied in with a lot of their advanced balloon-based research that they'd been doing during the Second World War, and various offshoots from these projects that would have continued had the war not concluded in 1945. So you had again this third strand of a story suggesting that there was a Japanese angle to, or a Far Eastern angle to, certain weird events in New Mexico in the summer of 1947, either at Los Alamos, at White Sands, or in the deserts outside Roswell. And I suppose at that particular time I didn't give that too much thought, but in the summer of 1996, I did a British TV show for the BBC called Out of This World. And this was sort of just a general paranormal show. One week it would be ghosts, one week it would be UFOs, the next week it would be the Kennedy assassination, that sort of thing. And after the show aired, I think in August 1996, and after it aired, when you appear on TV shows, people often contact you and say, hey, I know about that case, or my dad or mother, worked at this particular installation and told me something that sounds like the story that you're talking about. And so, it's not surprising to get phone calls or letters in the mail forwarded from the relevant company. And that's what happened. A number of people contacted me. One was a guy who worked at the British Home Office, which is an arm of the British government. And he asked if he could meet with me at a railway station called Euston Station in London. And which was kind of an unusual thing, but I agreed to the meet, and so went down and we had a chat. And he told me about how he'd seen files, read files that suggested that at some point in the 1950s, the US and UK governments had colluded, if you like, on a classified project in which people had been used in, for want of a better term, human experimentation, high-altitude flights and things like this, and that this had gone back to the 40s, and that some of these experiments had failed, they'd crashed, etc. And again, it was all hidden behind a UFO banner. And I suppose, this sort of turned a light on a little bit in my mind to the idea that, well, this is sort of similar in some ways to Melvin Brown's story about Chinese people and Tim Cooper's nurse at Los Alamos. Were these strands of the same story? Was it disinformation, or was it just people picking up on random things and misinterpreting it? I just didn't know. Then in 1998, and this is purely down to coincidence, but it's one of those sort of weird coincidences that happens from time to time, I wrote a book called The FBI Files, which was a study of historical FBI reports on UFOs that have been declassified through the terms of the American Freedom of Information Act, about 1,700 pages or so. And one of the chapters in the book was called The Oak Ridge Invasion, and this dealt with UFO sightings at a place called Oak Ridge, which is an atomic energy installation in Tennessee. And it's where a lot of the early cutting-edge research into atomic energy was undertaken. And I included in that book copies of various documents, and I think I related the details of probably about 20 cases that the FBI had recorded on file, and had basically put together a dossier of reports. Well, shortly after the book was published, I got a phone call from an elderly lady, literally a transatlantic call, saying, is that Nick Redfern who wrote the FBI files? I said, yeah, it is. And the lady said that she'd actually worked at Oak Ridge in the mid to late 1940s. And again, this is this bizarre coincidence. She actually knew one of the people referenced in the FBI's file, and it was a security guard who'd seen, or he believed he'd seen a UFO outside one of the gates at the Oak Ridge installation, and his name was mentioned in the file. And she said, oh, I know him, or I knew him, I should say. And, I can tell you more about it. And she said, are you going to be in the United States at all in the near future? And I said, well, probably not. She said, well, I live in Los Angeles, and if you ever are, let me know, and we can meet up. And, I guess I forgot about it for the next few years. And it actually wasn't until the summer of 2001 that I was next in the United States. And coincidentally, I was actually in Los Angeles. What happened was I was booked to do a sort of a West Coast tour of San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and then through Las Vegas, back down Las Vegas, and then through to Roswell. And I did the lecture for the Los Angeles MUFON group. And at the end of the meeting, a guy came up to me and introduced himself as being the son-in-law of the lady who'd phoned, and he said, you're Nick Redfern, aren't you? I said, yeah. And he said, do you remember getting a phone call from an old lady about 3 years ago? I said, yeah, I remember. And he said, well, I'm her son-in-law, and are you going to be in town for a few days? I said, yeah, we don't actually go to San Francisco for about another 3 or 4 days. And he said, she'd like to meet for lunch. So that's what we did. We met for lunch. And because she'd worked at Oak Ridge and she'd read my FBI files book and knew about some of the people and the cases, I thought naturally she was going to tell me about how maybe she knew about one of the incidents or even had seen a UFO herself over the base, as some of the people had claimed. But she wanted to talk about something completely different. And the thing she specifically did want to talk about was tied in with this whole angle of human experimentation using Japanese, I guess, captured Japanese people brought over at the end of the Second World War for use in various controversial experiments. Again, high-altitude experiments, radiation experiments, and high and low pressure experiments, all sorts of weird tests. And so I sit back and listen to what she had to say. Didn't judge her one way or the other. She was at least, I think at the time, she was let me get it right, I think she was 78 at the time, or 79, so she's like 84, 85 now. And, you know, I didn't consider her then, and I don't consider her now to be some sort of state-of-the-art disinformation agent or anything like that. Now, the story that she told me, which I'll go into detail of, you know, is it possible that she believed the story, but she'd been fed a fake story? You know, I don't dismiss that, and actually Stan Friedman told me personally that he doesn't believe that any of the people I interviewed actually lied to me. He thinks they are telling the truth as they believe it, but Stan thinks that they were fed this story to hide the fact that aliens crashed back in 47, and you know, it's their job to spread this story to confuse the waters and muddy the waters even more, which again isn't an impossible scenario, which is, you know, I'm trying to give you as much of the background as possible. And the story that she related to me was that she worked as a nurse at Oak Ridge, and this was, remember, this was 1945 to about 1949 she was there, and this was at the very early years of atomic energy research. Bear in mind that the atomic bomb had only been exploded in the summer of 1945, you know, when, you know, Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were taken out by the atomic bombs, which ironically enough were flown from Roswell. Roswell at the time was the only base in the US that housed atomic weapons, because that was where literally the only atomic weapons were. So she said that on a number of occasions between 45, 47, various bodies had been brought into the base that looked like, to Oak Ridge, that looked like they'd been involved in some sort of horrific accidents. A number of the bodies were, she said, literally pulverized, as if they looked like they'd fallen from a great height, or they'd been involved in an aircraft accident, you know, just destroyed, destructed. A number of the other ones, she said, were actually sort of curiously not disfigured or dismembered in any way, but, you know, she wasn't sure how they died. She said some of them were definitely normal-looking Japanese or Chinese people. She said some of them were certainly Japanese or Chinese, but they looked like they were suffering from certain deformities. And one of them, she said, was progeria. And progeria is, if you've probably seen people, or you may have seen people with progeria, it's a very fast-aging illness. So people very, very rarely live beyond the age of 20 or so. And it's a very weird syndrome where, no disrespect to the people who suffer from it, they look unusual. They have a dwarfish body, a small body. They don't have any body hair at all, and the head grows very, very large. I've got a picture which I'll show you later. So bear in mind, she's talking about short people, enlarged bald heads in the summer of 1947, which, you know, is, you have to wonder, is this tied in with some of these reports about dwarfish small people with enlarged bald heads being found at Roswell? Bear in mind also that the Oak Ridge installation that she worked at was doing cutting-edge early research into nuclear-powered aircraft. Now, although the nuclear-powered aircraft project at the time certainly didn't get off the ground, they were working on some very weird-looking projects and ideas for aircraft that, you know, are very far advanced from, you know, what was being flown in the Second World War or even in the post-war era. So this was the bones of her story, and she said she was aware of sort of a handful of bodies that she saw personally. And again, the rumour mill going around the base was that these people had been brought over from Japan in a similar fashion to the Operation Paperclip with the Germans, to really to try and advance some of the scientific knowledge that was in the hands of the Germans and the Japanese in the Second World War. And there's no doubt that, you know, had the war not been concluded, had it continued, you know, the Germans particularly were working on some very, very radical aircraft designs of a type that far exceeded really anything that America or Britain or anywhere in Europe were working on. And I'll show you some pictures some later as well. And you know, had that been the case that the war hadn't concluded, you know, it's not impossible that if the Germans had, you know, had a few strokes of luck and, you know, we had a few strokes of bad luck, you know, they could have, you know, potentially won the war if they'd played it properly. So this was the story she related to me. And of course, this story in 2001 was practically identical to the British story that I got back in '96 from the guy at the Home Office, which in turn was similar to Tim Cooper's story and Tim Good's stories. So I began putting all this information together, and she said to me, well, I said to her, sorry, I said, you know, are there any other people you can kind of direct me to who knows something about this story? And she said, yeah. She said, you know, I can put you in contact with a couple of other people. And she gave me 2 names, and I began trying to track these people down. And of course, you know, you do a Google search or a Yellow Pages search or a White Pages search. You know, if it's John Smith, you've got no chance of finding a John Smith. You know, if it's something a little bit out the ordinary, which a couple of the names were, you know, you can trim it down to maybe 50 or 60, which is actually what I did. Everybody I phoned denied being the person in question. And, you know, I sent letters off to some people. I even got friends to phone them up, so, you know, it didn't sound like an English person on the other side of the world asking questions about an American citizen, you know, which they might clam up anyway, saying, you know, why is this person phoning? What happened was, after about 5 months, I got a phone call from a guy named Al Barker, basically saying, is this Nick Redfern? I said yes, and he said, you know, why are you looking for me? And, you know, so what I think had happened, I'm only guessing now, but one of 2 things happened. Either the lady from Oak Ridge had told him that she told me his name and that I'd be looking, or I actually did reach the right person or the right family at some point, and then that person, you know, quickly backtracked and said, no, you've got the wrong person, and then maybe down the line spoke to her, and then possibly from there decided to speak out. And I said, well, you know, I just wanted to speak to you about what happened back in 1947, 46, 48, some of these stories I've heard. And he said, well, you know, well, who are you? Why are you looking? And he said that sort of 3 or 4 times. He said, why are you looking for me? And, you know, I did wonder if this wasn't the first time this had happened, and if he had concerns that it was actually, you know, the government looking for him to try and determine what he'd been involved in back then. Because one of the indications I got from this story was that, ironically, today, you know, how we're all pushing the government to release the Roswell files, etc. The story I got from him was that, I mean, bear in mind, this is if it's a true story. The story I got from him was that because some of these experiments were controversial and, I guess, experimental, that when it all went wrong and these things were just not seen as viable experiments, that to hide the story, they destroyed everything. And he said that, in his opinion, today's government may suspect what went on, but actually cannot prove it because the files were destroyed years ago. So his view is that, you know, when we're pushing the government to release anything, they actually may not be much more in the know than we are to this day. They may have sort of institutional memory of something controversial having happened, and perhaps have a suspicion that somebody illegally destroyed files years ago, but may not exactly know why, how, where and when. So this was sort of going from a story where I had the bare bones to a couple of other people coming forward. Now, Barker also talked about people being brought over from Japan. A number, again, he said, were dwarfs and people. I asked this question, I said, you know, why were they using dwarfs and handicapped people? And he said, actually, it wasn't, there was no sort of advantage in using handicapped people. He said one of the reasons they were used was because back then there was a lot of stigma attached to mental and physical handicaps, and it was easier to get hold of people who wouldn't be missed than it would, you know, pulling somebody off the streets, which sounds horrendous, that the idea that that could actually happen in the first place. But if you look at the nuclear aircraft files that have been declassified from Oak Ridge from 48, they actually, and you can go to the National Archives and read these, one of them actually mentions how a doctor at Oak Ridge was trying to petition the US prison service to allow them to use prisoners in high-altitude prototype aircraft experiments. So there is, if you like, a background and a historical angle to this particular allegation. So, you know, I listened to what Barker had to say, and he also told me about how a number of the people that had been brought over were attached to a Japanese wartime project called Unit 731. And Unit 731 was a very, very controversial, I'll say, quote, scientific branch, because there wasn't really much scientific that they did in terms of, you know, actually trying to help people. It was almost the exact opposite. It was trying to find ways to kill people. Unit 731 was one of the very early Japanese projects involving biological warfare. Basically, they would do things like for example, they'd get infected fleas with bubonic plague, and they'd load them into aircraft and then fly over a Chinese village and release all these fleas. So it would basically cause an outbreak of bubonic plague. So it was basically trying to find ways of using biological warfare on the battlefield. And they did a lot of horrendous experiments on people. And the story I got was that in the same way that a lot of German scientists were brought over at the end of the war, so were the Unit 731 people. And also, during the Second World War, the Japanese were... That's not a UFO, by the way. It's not a cloud. It's called a Fugo balloon. And the Fugo balloons were kind of ingenious devices that the Japanese launched at mainland USA in the latter stages of the Second World War, sort of 44, 45. And what they were large, sort of 30-foot balloons, and no passengers on board or anything like that. And they'd have a bomb attached to the beneath them. And they were calibrated so that they would fly from Japan. They would be carried by the Pacific winds to the US, and they would be calibrated so that they would descend over time. And the Japanese worked out that by putting different weights and devices on them, they could actually get them to hit the ground on US soil. It would take them that long to travel across, and they'd slowly dip and dip and dip. And when they'd hit the ground, the bombs would go off. And of course, there was no way to determine where they would land. It was just dictated by the wind. But of course, the idea was it was like a psychological terror weapon, you know, the idea that these balloons could come down anywhere and crash on US soil. And that's sort of an official drawing of what they look like. As you can see, you've got the big balloon at the top, and then the bomb device, which contained 4 incendiary bombs at the bottom, and a 33-pound anti-personnel bomb. So they were, in some ways, they're kind of pretty sophisticated, but on the other hand, they were sort of equally very, very, I guess, sort of, you know, ingeniously simple as well. And literally hundreds of these things were flown over the US, or flown towards the US, and the FBI at the time put out not so much a warning, but a guideline for newspapers saying, you know, can you not report on this? Because if you report on it and the US public panic, the Japanese are going to realise they've got a psychological advantage over us. So all the major US, or not just major, but pretty much every US newspaper editor agreed not to report on these attacks. And then, of course, the Japanese were thinking, well, you know, our project must have failed. There's nothing in the newspapers about it at all. And so you had a lot of these balloons being flown over. This is actually a photograph taken by a US Air Force fighter plane over the Pacific as one of these things approached the US coastline, and this one was actually shot down. A lot of them were shot down when the US began to realise that, you know, these weird balloons were coming towards the US, and the first inkling that they got, that the US Air Force got, or the government got, that these balloon attacks were being undertaken, was that they found a huge pile of shredded balloon debris in the Pacific Ocean, and questions were asked, you know, has the Coast Guard lost a balloon? Has the Air Force, ironically they asked, lost a weather balloon? All the answers came back, no. And then they recovered it and found that, you know, it didn't even look like it was made out of American materials. It was, you know, something different. And of course, then other balloons began to be seen. And the Air Force set up various projects. One was to try and determine where they were being flown from. Another one was to recover them. And a third one was to shoot them down. And there were different teams around the US would get involved in different ways. And one of the things that the Air Force found out was that in addition to flying these balloons with bombs, the Japanese also had plans to load them with biological warfare weaponry, missiles and shells and things like this that would explode on impact and basically, you know, disperse bubonic plague or something like that in whichever location it landed on. And the attacks, for the most part, weren't successful. There were a few explosions, but because the balloons tended to just fall on the Pacific Northwest coast, they just landed in woods and forests. And I think there was actually only one case of people being killed. And that was only because there was a party out having a picnic in the woods, and somebody found this big balloon, went over to it and tugged on the bomb, of all places to tug on, and it went off and killed a family of sort of 5 or 6 people. But that was the only recorded, as far as we know, case of anybody actually being killed on US soil by one of these balloon bombs. And actually, every so often, even now, people still find some of the old rusted shell cases in the woods. And there was a big recovery in Canada in 1953 where the woods were actually closed off because the bomb was found to be live, and they recovered the balloon and the bomb and detonated it on some army base somewhere. So we know for a fact that the Japanese were working on these advanced balloon designs. Now, as I mentioned, had the war not come to a close in 1945, the Japanese actually had plans to build far more sophisticated balloons beyond the conventional Fugo balloons, as they became known, or balloon bombs. And one of the plans that the Japanese had, let's take a drink, was to build very, very large balloons, almost like the Goodyear balloons, not circular shape like that, but almost like a Zeppelin type balloon. And these would have a fixed gondola beneath them with a crew on board. And again, the plan was to launch huge balloon raids on the US from a high altitude. And the third plan they had, and this was sort of very, very much a prototype experimental idea, was to again have a huge balloon, but beneath it there would be fixed, sort of fixed wing rigid glider aircraft, and the plan was to fly the balloons very high over US soil to evade radar, and then at some point the crew on board would be able to release the vehicle from the balloons and basically come down vertically, well, not literally vertically, but be able to avoid the radar by coming across. Of course, none of these plans were put into practice purely and simply because the war came to an end. But nevertheless, the US forces learned of these projects when they went over to Japan at the end of the Second World War. Various papers were brought back and files. And US newspapers in 1945 actually talk, I've got copies back at home, I don't unfortunately have them on slide, but talk about these plans that the Japanese had to build these large balloon arrays, actually talk about how, because weight and premium would have to be, weight and space would have to be kept to a premium and a minimum. They talk about how it would be necessary for probably a crew of 4 or 5 people at the very most to be used in these gondolas, and they'd probably be, small guys. They wouldn't be 6-footers because there'd be this lengthy flight across the Pacific. So, we have strands of a story involving relatively small, not dwarfs, but 5'1", 5'2" Japanese guys flying in a large balloon. So again, on its own, this doesn't mean anything. But collectively, when I looked at these other stories, like the lady from Oak Ridge, it kind of suggested to me that we were dealing with something else as well that was potentially of more significance. These next 3 photographs, these are all related to the work of Unit 731. And as I said, Unit 731, it's just grisly, outlandish work that really, you could not justify the sort of things they did. I mean, literally taking blood transfusions, taking people's blood out of them and inserting antifreeze and, cow's blood and things like that just to see what would happen. And exposing people to freezing temperatures. And I mean, even today, I know, particularly in England and Australia, a lot of troops who are serving out there, they'll never forget or forgive the Unit 731 people for some of the atrocities that they carried out. On not just dead bodies and living people, on children and women, all sorts. And that's just one of the experiments there. You can see a guy in a complete protection suit and a small body, just doing all sorts of bizarre human experiments. And when you look back at that particular period of time, there were a lot of weird human experiments being undertaken, not just in Japan, but in Germany. And under the Clinton administration in the mid-1990s, the government declassified a whole range of files that became known as the Human Radiation Experiment files, which are now available at the National Archives. And again, they talk about how people are being used in radiation experiments in the US, basically to determine the effects of radiation on the human body and exposing people with cancer to new and experimental treatments that really, in many cases, did more harm than they actually did good. Again, that's another one of the doctors, if you want to call them doctors. Now we come to the other angle of the story, unconventional radical aircraft being designed in the 1940s. I think any of us who watch, war films and, Hollywood films of the Second World War, you go to an aircraft museum, everybody sees things like the B-29, Super Fortress, the Flying Fortress, fighter aircraft. You don't expect to see something like that which was built in the Second World War. That's sort of an unusual aircraft, to say the least. And the story I got was that it was something along the lines of that was test flown on at least one occasion in the New Mexico desert, and that it was rigidly fixed below this huge balloon array with the idea of launching it high in the sky just as an experiment to see if this was feasible, and then having it detach and basically land. The story I got was that the whole thing, because it was such a prototype, unconventional thing, this huge balloon array with this aircraft like a swept-back wing V-shaped aircraft being attached to it, that it simply failed. It just didn't work, and supposedly a number of, possibly maybe 2 more experiments were launched, and each one was just unwieldy and just crashed, and eventually it was, okay guys, let's put it on the back burner, let's put it on the drawing board again and look at it and see if we can come to some conclusion as to why this isn't, a viable experiment and why it's just too unwieldy. So that was the next angle of the story, I guess, the idea that, we had these huge post-Fugo balloons being brought over secretly, or the designs brought over secretly with the scientists from Japan in 1945 and taken to New Mexico along with some of the Operation Paperclip scientists, and from there they would construct these, I guess the best way to describe it is like hybrid aircraft. You've got a balloon in conjunction with an unusual aircraft design. There's another of the Horton aircraft. I should point out that last picture and that one and that one. They look weird. They look like you see those things in the sky, you could think, wow, flying saucer. And that one doesn't look too dissimilar at all to the objects that Kenneth Arnold saw on June the 24th, 1947, which, although his sighting coined the term flying saucer, what Arnold actually said was that they skipped or they flew in the sky like a saucer would if you skipped it across water. Like throwing a pebble across the water. And so the term flying saucer stuck. But Arnold actually described the objects he saw as being kind of crescent-shaped or half-moon shaped, which I guess is not dissimilar to that thing. So again, you have to look at the historical military context of what was going on at the same time period that people were seeing flying saucers. We had these unusual human experiments. We have these very weird looking aircraft, and we have radical balloon designs all being used in conjunction with each other, and people being used as guinea pigs in some of these high altitude experiments involving balloons and unusual aircraft. Now that's the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, and back in the mid-1940s, a very, very different place. Very sort of radical, early prototype experimental work was undertaken there. And also, it was also from White Sands where a lot of the early German V-2 rockets were taken, and Fort Bliss, I should say, and test flown under the auspices of the German scientists such as Werner von Braun, who'd been brought over. Operation Paperclip, which was the project to secretly bring German scientists to the US at the end of the Second World War, was a huge operation, and it was designed really to make sure that at the end of the Second World War, that the German scientists who were working on a lot of cutting-edge rocket research, aircraft technology, ballistics, all sort of things, it was to make sure they didn't fall into the hands of the Russians and start working for them. So they were brought over to here, and some to England, and offered the deal you can't refuse, basically, I guess, in some cases, and began working at White Sands. So again, you have this angle of scientists who'd been working on radical aircraft designs being taken to White Sands, which is, literally in, I guess, geographical terms and also, in aviation terms, is just down the road from where we are right now. And again, this is something I always stress to people: look at the historical context and the locations. Don't just look at the crash and the incident. Look at what was going on in the surrounding area and arena. And that's one of the V2 rockets being tested. And again, as I said, had the war not finished in 1945, it's entirely possible that if Hitler had been a little bit more clear-headed, the Germans could well have won the war. Coming from England, my mother was from the city of Norwich, and the V2 rockets flown from Germany actually reached England and decimated the city of Norwich where she lived. They used to have a bunker that they dug in their back garden where, when the sirens would go off, they would head down to the bunker and stay down there until the all clear was given, and a lot of the city was flattened. You consider 62 years ago, that these rockets were being flown all the way from Germany to precise cities in England. That shows you how advanced Hitler's technology was at the time, albeit for the fact that he was doing it for the wrong purpose, but his technology was far in advance of a lot of the things that the Allied forces were using at that particular time. So that was why it was imperative to ensure that the work that was being done at a scientific and technical level in Germany was brought over to the United States, and that was certainly also the case with the situation in Japan as well. Now, as I said, Oak Ridge was the home from 1946 through to the early 50s of a project called NEPA. And NEPA was the Nuclear Energy for Propulsion of Aircraft project. And the idea was, it was sort of an ambitious project to build nuclear-powered aircraft. And the idea was, you wouldn't have propellers on aircraft, you wouldn't have jet engines, you would have these radical nuclear-powered aircraft that could stay aloft in the skies, literally, I won't say, for all eternity, but, far exceeding anything that conventional technology would allow you to do. Now, this particular picture, as you can see, that part that's being loaded at the front is actually not the crew section. That would be the reactor, the nuclear reactor of the aircraft, if you like, that would be utilised on a flight. Now, of course, if we were actually flying these things back in 46, 47, we would know about it, and we certainly weren't. Experiments were undertaken, but it was found that the reactors for the aircraft would have to be so big and so huge, so heavy, that the planes would barely get off the ground. And on top of that, the crews would just be suffering from radiation sickness, and it would just make the whole thing pointless, at least with that level of technology that existed back in the late 40s. But certainly experiments were done, and one of the things that I included in the book was a document actually from the summer of 47, which talks about how a number of German scientists have been, being brought over, and who were being employed to utilise not so much a new technology, but apparently what was described in the file as a revolutionary design to infuse nuclear technology into aircraft technology. And it's kind of a grey area as to the level and extent that these experiments were allegedly undertaken. We're just not entirely sure because we don't have the full picture, but we do know from officially declassified files at the National Archives that somebody at Oak Ridge, where the old lady who I interviewed said, she'd seen these weird bodies, people at Oak Ridge were working on nuclear-powered aircraft projects. And this particular project was followed by another one called the ANP project, which was the Aircraft Nuclear Project. And again, they didn't really have any successes of a truly startling nature, purely and simply because of the size of the reactors and the problems with creating shielding materials, so the crew don't get radiation sickness within 5 minutes of taking to the skies. So again, you have this situation of another location, the Oak Ridge installation, where, there's Oak Ridge. You've got this installation at Oak Ridge where unusual aircraft are being tested and where people with progeria were being used in radiation experiments. That's a person with progeria. Now, no disrespect to them, as I said, people with progeria look unusual. Now, there's an offshoot of progeria, which is called progeria of the adult. Progeria of the adult is actually most prevalent in one particular country in the world, and that's Japan. it's actually due to close breeding is what actually set it off in the first place. So again, you have progeria of the adult most prevalent in Japan, and no disrespect. You see a person with progeria in a situation like this using a high altitude experiment, the body's laid out in the desert for 2 days, and you come across it. What do you think if you see this huge field of materials, an unconventional looking aircraft? Just hark back to that. You see that crashed in the desert with possibly the debris from that, and you see that laid out in the desert after 2 days. It is possible, in my mind at least, it's not impossible to come to the conclusion that something truly out of this world happened, when in reality and horrifically something very, very down to earth could have happened that could possibly in some ways explain all this. Now, that kind of, I guess, is sort of an unusual picture to have in a UFO lecture. That's actually a family of dwarfs that were held by the Nazis in the Second World War. And the Nazis did similar experiments to the Japanese. And one of them, Dr. Joseph Mengele, was, by his own admission, fascinated by dwarfs and twins. And he did all sorts, again, of weird experiments on people. These were some of the lucky survivors, and actually wrote a book, or one of the surviving members wrote a book about their experiences, and they became kind of like a famous circus act in the 1940s and 50s. And so, again, when you begin to look into it, you do find these stories of, people having been used in unusual tests, and people who, again, no disrespect, in some cases, particularly with progeria, did look kind of unusual. So, it was a case that I began to put these threads together, and collectively I interviewed 6 people, the English guy, the lady from Oak Ridge, 3 American intelligence guys, former American intelligence guys, who related accounts to me that sort of broadly fitted this scenario. Now, the reason and the why and the wherefore as to how they knew this story, or how they claimed to know this story, this is moving on from the lady at Oak Ridge, was that none of these were actually at Roswell. And this is why, certain people have said, well, is it possible that these guys were deceived and lied to? Their job in the early 1950s, they said that the Russians were beginning to snoop around, in the 40s, the Russians were beginning to snoop around New Mexico because they realised that America was beginning to work on some cutting-edge technology that was captured from the Germans, such as rocket technology. And so the Russians wanted to know how far we got ahead. And so they were sending spies over, etc. And apparently at some point the Russians had learned about these accidents in the desert with these prototype aircraft crashing and guinea pig crews being used, and bodies being found in the desert with enlarged heads that look strange, and it all being hidden under flying disc and weather balloon stories. And the 3 guys I interviewed said that their job, although they weren't at Roswell, they didn't see the original Roswell files, it was their job to push to the Soviets and the UFO research community faked and bogus crashed UFO stories to hide what was, from their perspective, something even more controversial, the idea that, the scientific elite were basically using people in horrific experiments without their knowledge, without their consent. And of course the concern was that if the Russians found out, they would exploit this to the hilt, how dare this go on. And so the people I spoke with said it was their job to construct documents and to leak stories to the UFO research community, to the Russians, and swamp everybody that would even begin to look into these stories, swamp them with crashed UFO stories to distract them away from this. So the idea was that things like the Majestic 12 documents were a diversion. So, researcher John Smith or Bill Jones or whoever spends years researching the Majestic 12 documents and spends time at archives, money, going to this location, going to that location. But then, all the time the real secret is conveniently hidden because the person is, chasing crashed UFOs, shall we say. And they told me that it was their job to construct these documents, and to allow them to do this, they got a basic summary of what they said was the truth behind these 1947 New Mexico crashes, namely the sort of things I've just discussed. Now, as I said, people like Stan have said to me, well, is it not possible that this is just another cover story? If aliens really did crash, which, which I'll stress, I don't rule it out. What I've tried to do, although people have sort of painted me as the bad guy of ufology for doing this, that isn't the case. What I wanted to do was to put the information out there so people could see it. And, if somebody came forward and said, hey, Nick, I worked on this project 40 years ago, and we actually created this scenario of the Japanese to hide the fact that aliens really did crash, then I would tell people that, because that would boost the ET angle. So I just wanted to put the information out for people to see. And so, this was sort of, I won't say this is as far as it's got, because there is new information which I'll tell you about shortly, but this was the extent that I was able to take it to the point when the book came out in 2005. I wrote the book, completed the interview, in early 2004, and I got the bare bones written and spent the rest of the year pretty much writing it, and then it was published in June 2005, June the 21st. And even the timing of the book was strange. I actually think this is just a weird coincidence, but on June the 21st, 2005, the day the book was published, there was a meeting held at the National Archives in Washington, which was attended by various people from the CIA, the FBI, the National Security Council, and it was all to do with the declassification of wartime documents. And the whole purpose of the meeting was to discuss to what extent the still classified files from the Japanese government's Unit 731 could be declassified. So this was sort of unusual. I actually do think that it's a coincidence with the date time-wise. I'm not sort of so egotistical as to think that the CIA had a big meeting about my book on the day it was published. But, strange things, weird coincidences like that do happen. And so, this sort of opened this angle up to the UFO research community, I suppose, even more. And all hell, metaphorically, as I said, broke loose when the book was published. And, I had people saying, I'd completely done a total reversal on my beliefs, or that I was being paid millions of dollars by the CIA or whoever. And, so I was like, well, if I was being paid millions of dollars by the CIA, I was like, where's the Ferrari and the Lamborghini, But, joking aside, that is what was said. And all I was really trying to do was put in print form what I'm telling you now, a story of that in some ways was kind of like an unusual detective story of me tracking down and interviewing sort of people literally in the late 70s and early 80s. And, I mentioned at the beginning how the publisher just wanted to focus upon me talking about the facts, and that was fine. I didn't have any problem with that. One of the strangest things about the story was the way in which many of the interviews were actually conducted. It was literally a case of getting a phone call and saying, if you want to speak to this guy, Al Barker, you'll go to, there's actually a particular restaurant on the way to Waco where we did the interviews. So although I'm British, I live in Dallas, so that didn't make it too difficult. But it was literally the first time that I did the first interview with this guy Barker. It was, go to this particular restaurant on the way to Waco, told me the exit that it was on. It was a Mexican restaurant on a particular exit on the road to Waco, and sit down, you'll just see this short, elderly guy, and you won't be able to miss him. And that's literally how it began. And it was a case of sitting down with him and talking. And again, at that first interview, it was, why are you looking for me? And I think, reading between the lines, he did have concerns that because he was of the opinion that the government had destroyed all these files and the evidence years ago to prevent the story getting out, he was concerned that now, sort of guys in the 20s, 30s, 40s who were in the military had been ordered to find out what really happened back then, because they were in the dark as much as the UFO community was. And I think he thought that this is what was going on, that I'd been sort of hired or I was actually in the military or something like that, to find him, which, certainly wasn't the case. I was just following up on this story. And so it was really getting his confidence, getting the confidence of some of the other people. And, from there, saying, well, okay, you've told me your stories, you've related the facts to me, what can I do with this? Can I publish the story? And they, I guess, got together and talked and spoke and said, well, okay. And, their concern was not some sort of X-Files thing about them going to get shot or assassinated, or a tire's going to blow out one night and they're going to vanish. Nothing like that. It was the down-to-earth things that would probably affect everybody. Am I going to lose my military or government pension? Which is the sort of thing that, you'd expect. There was never sort of any sort of real cloak and dagger X-Files thing making it sort of really, espionage, James Bond type situations. Nothing like that. It actually was a case of how you might expect some old guy in his late 70s or early 80s would react, knowing that he was about to violate a security oath that he'd sworn however many years before. So, I had sympathies with these people, but it was almost like, they were the ones who sent the train down the track, so to speak. The wheels were running, and how do you kind of stop the train when it's already started? So, I chatted with the publisher, and then we chatted with the interviewees, and, we came to an agreement where a couple of the people were okay about being quoted on the record. The lady from Oak Ridge and one of the guys who related more details than all of the others, who work for the Defence Intelligence Agency, they flat would not allow their names to be used, although it all had to be cleared with Simon & Schuster's attorneys as far as, what would go in and what wouldn't go in. And so we came to this conclusion as to, how we could present the book and the details, etc. And so, that's what I did. And since the book's been published in July 2005, as I said, it's been a case of how dare you say this, how dare you cast aspersions on Roswell, etc., etc. But, trying to follow up and see if any new leads come forward. And, a number of things have come forward. I mean, this is Leonard Stringfield. Stringfield was the guy who, as I said, published in 1991 Tim Cooper's reports on this nurse from Los Alamos who said she was aware of these Japanese bodies having been brought in from 45 to 47. And supposedly they were in kind of like, I guess, not so much cryogenic, but almost like refrigeration state to preserve the bodies. They're actually already dead, but they were used somehow in various experiments. And one of the things I did when I found out this revelation that Stringfield had published, sort of 14 years before my book was published, and it followed a similar path, I began to look back in some of Stringfield's other reports. And there are a number of, although it's primarily references in his reports to crashed UFOs and aliens, he does occasionally quote a source or cite a source who talks about German technology and prototype aircraft crashes in the desert that were hidden under a UFO banner. Now that guy on the right with his hand up in the air, that's a guy named Dr. Lincoln La Paz. Dr. Lincoln La Paz is a very well-respected scientist, particularly in the field of astronomy, in the Second World War, in the 40s, 50s, and in the late 1940s, he worked on a project in conjunction with the Air Force called Project Twinkle. Kind of a strange name, but what it was, throughout the state of New Mexico, from roughly about 48 to 52, there were a lot of reports of something that became known as green fireballs. And these were not described like UFOs, but they were described as balls of green light that would flash over New Mexico, and particularly in areas surrounding atomic energy installations. And there are a lot of theories as to what was going on. Were they some sort of offshoot of UFOs that were sort of surveying the area? Was it possible that there was some sort of top secret experiments going on that even parts of the Air Force weren't cleared to know about, but that somebody else was doing? Nobody really knew. So Project Twinkle was created, and Dr. Lincoln La Paz was one of the prime players in the story. And he collated various reports, travelled out to various sites where people had said they'd seen these green fireballs come down. Could he find any information, any wreckage on the ground or debris from the balloons, from the green fireballs, etc.? And the answer was no. There was never really any definitive materials ever found. Now, because Project Twinkle had kind of like a UFO angle to it, and the UFO angle was discussed quite freely and widely by the staff who were attached to Project Twinkle. This has led to suggestions that Dr. Lincoln LaPaz was also cleared for secret UFO information. Well, if we go back to Roswell, a number of people have said that Lincoln LaPaz was actually heavily involved in certain aspects of the Roswell crash, and that apparently he travelled out with one particular military guy to one of the areas where it was said that the UFO had crashed or touched down, and there was supposedly a burnt mark on the ground. And the story was that Lincoln LaPaz had come to the conclusion that some sort of interplanetary probe had crashed at Roswell, and that was his final conclusion, if you like. That may well be true. That could well be the case. I don't dispute the memories of the person who told this story or what Dr. Lincoln LaPaz told him. And coupled with the fact that Lincoln LaPaz worked on the Green Fireball project does put him centre place in late 1940s UFO studies. However, this is one of the things that I found while I was researching Dr. Lincoln LaPaz. And this is a late 1940s document from the University of New Mexico, Albuquerque, where Lincoln LaPaz worked. And I'll just read to you what it says. Dr. Lincoln LaPaz of the University of New Mexico was in the thick of the fight against Japanese plans to send disease germs into America by balloon, said President J.P. Wernett of the university today. Commenting upon stories from the Navy in Washington revealing that the use of germs and viruses in the Jap balloon barrage was an enemy project as the war came to an end, Dr. Wernett said Dr. LaPaz, head of the Department of Mathematics and the university's Institute of Meteoritics, was with the government's secret anti-balloon project during the war. Quote, if the war had not ended when it did, in the opening stages of a full-scale balloon offensive, which probably would have taken place between October 1945 and now, when the velocity of the west wind at high altitude is at its greatest, this country would have had unpleasant experiences, Dr. LaPaz said today. So here we have an example. I won't read the rest, which is just basically in the same vein. But here we have Dr. Lincoln LaPaz, who has been placed at Roswell in 1947. We now have official documents from the University of Mexico confirming that only 3 years before, he was also secretly and heavily involved in analysing the Japanese Fugo balloons that I was told led to these far more advanced balloon designs. And here's another one that also talks about LaPaz's involvement in this project. It basically covers a similar path. So, here was something else that links Japan with New Mexico with Roswell. Now, that's a person that some of you may know, Philip Corso, wrote the book Day After Roswell. Very controversial but interesting book. Corso worked in the Army's Foreign Technology Division in the early 1960s and said that it was his job basically to seed alien technology into the basic US industry, if you like, to try and further US technology, business, etc., and exploit and make use and back engineer captured alien technology found at Roswell. And according to Corso, this led to the creation of things like fibre optics, night vision, things like that, today we take for granted. And it was his opinion that having seen some of the, as he called it, alien wreckage from Roswell, that US scientists were able to back engineer this material and create our own versions that were readily for use on the battlefield or, in government industry, in the defence community, etc. Well, there's Corso's book, The Day After Roswell, and as it says, a former Pentagon official reveals the US government's shocking UFO cover-up. This was published in '97, and because Corso, did have a credible background, and we were able to prove that he did hold the position that he said he held, and when somebody like that comes out, that makes waves, and it's like, wow, this person actually did work in that particular job, and he's making these claims about actually seeing an alien body and handling alien technology, which again, he may well have done. It could be a completely true story. One of the interesting things about Corso is that he was very close friends with a man named Charles Willoughby. Charles Willoughby was a brigadier general in the US Army in the Second World War, and very close, excuse me, very sort of senior source within the US Army. What's interesting about Willoughby is that it was his particular job. He was the one person who oversaw the project to bring to the US the Japanese government's Unit 731 medical experiment files. So again, you have Corso tied to Roswell, close friends with Willoughby, whose job it was to bring the Japanese files over to the United States. So again, these are the sort of other things that have surfaced in the wake of the publication of the book, just by doing further research and other people coming forward. Now, another place I want to talk about is Fort Stanton. Now, if you look where the star is on that map, that's Fort Stanton. If you look to the right, you see Roswell. Fort Stanton was a military base, and during the Second World War, it was actually home to Japanese prisoners of war. When Pearl Harbor occurred and a lot of Japanese were interned, a lot of them were taken to Fort Stanton. In the post-war era, a number of physically and mentally handicapped people were also held at Fort Stanton. So again, you know, I was told that Japanese people and mentally and physically handicapped people were used in some of these flights. Then we find at Fort Stanton, which is literally a stone's throw from Roswell, were actually housed at that particular base. That doesn't prove anything, but you know, when you keep coming back to connections between Roswell and Japan, Roswell, Japan, Roswell, Japan, you know, for me at least, it means we should at least look into the story and not take the approach that some have done and hysterically, you know, claim I'm some sort of man in black or something like that. So that's sort of basically where things are at right now. One other story that did come forward came from a well-respected Australian researcher named Keith Basterfield. Keith posted a story on the Project 1947 discussion list, I should say, and contacted me personally to say that about 6 months before my book was published, that he was actually given a practically identical story of high-altitude balloon experiments undertaken in 1947 in the New Mexico desert, in which people had been used and they crashed off range, and before the military could get there, a number of civilians like Mac Brazel stumbled upon the wreckage and possibly even a body, and you know, the whole thing blew wide open. And Keith put me in touch directly with his source, whose father worked in British intelligence in the in the 50s, and who Keith's source had got the story from. And Keith sent me a summary of the interview that he'd done with the guy, and then I subsequently interviewed him as well. And you know, the story was a match, and it was almost identical to the ones that I related in the book. But Keith confirmed in writing that he was given this story round about the end of 2004 by a source in Australia where he lives, and my book came out in June 2005. So the thing is that if it's disinformation, you know, it didn't begin with the people who were relating the stories to me. Popular Mechanics published this story in 97. Leonard Stringfield published his story about Tim Cooper in 91. Keith Basterfield's source said that his father knew about this in the 1950s. So if it's disinformation, it was put into place many, many years ago, but wasn't used, and now it's surfacing with these people believing it's real. Or it's real, and the UFO angle is the cover. And that's, if you like, the stalemate that we're at right now, is trying to determine, you know, it's almost like which came first, the chicken or the egg, you know, is this the cover story for that, or is that the cover story for this? As I said, I think the ironic thing, the most ironic thing, as I was told, was that today's government, if this really was the case, and these were illegal experiments that were hidden and the documents were shredded and everybody was told to keep silent, today's government, who we're pressing to reveal the truth about Roswell, may actually know less than we, the UFO research community, actually does. So hope, you know, in that sort of hour and however long it was, I've sort of given you an indication of not just the theory as to what lies at the heart of the book in terms of the crash and the incident, but the historical background of what was going on in that period of Unit 731, the Fugo balloons, these very, very weird aircraft designs I'll just quickly run through them again. So, things like that. Oak Ridge, White Sands, prototype nuclear aircraft, people with unfortunate medical conditions, all in this clearly delineated period of the early to mid-40s through the late 1940s, and then suddenly, to an extent, it all comes to a halt. And, is that because if it was aliens that they perfected a technology where they weren't suddenly crashing, all across New Mexico in this short period? Or was it because, as I was told, that these were illegal experiments and that were hastily and quickly shut down when they were seen as not really being, I guess, a good representation of advancing US scientific knowledge and technology? I just don't know. And that's my honest answer, is that that's about as far as I've got with the story so far. And I think that, the responsible thing is to put it out there so people can judge it for themselves, and hopefully if anybody knows something pro or con about the story, they can come forward and address the claims, and and we can take it to the next stage, whatever that may be. So I hope that's sort of given you some background. If anybody's got any questions in the last 14 minutes, I think we need to be tight on the deadline. I'll be happy to try and answer them for you. Thanks a lot.
Great talk, Nick.
Thanks, Peter.
Question. You discussed Stan Friedman's reaction, and Stan is, among other things, a true scholar and a gentleman.
Yeah.
And I expect
nice
nothing
guy.
less from him. But without violating confidences or naming names, you have really attacked the holy grail of ufology here, and so many people are married to the story of it has to be aliens.
No,
yeah.
Yeah,
I'm just curious to know how dramatic some of the reactions have been from some of our colleagues, unnamed, giving you a hard time about being such a rat turncoat.
Thank you.
I can say that to him.
You can say that, I know. I think he is a friend, actually, believe it or not. I think it's kind of difficult because you're quite right. I actually mentioned this at the very beginning about how Roswell, my views on ufology as a whole haven't changed, in the sense that I believe there's a genuine UFO mystery from somewhere else. I'm just not sure it crashed at Roswell. It may have done, I'm just not sure. But I think the problem is that Roswell's been elevated to such a level of importance when there are many other cases which, certainly in different ways, are equally of importance. And but I think the fact that particularly the UFO research community places so much, not just confidence, but places so much faith in Roswell and importance in Roswell and significance in Roswell, which may be well placed, but if it isn't, then if that case collapses, it shouldn't be the end of ufology. But I think for a lot of people, it is perceived that way, that if Roswell goes down, the whole pack of cards goes down. And I think that's why I got a lot of the response that I did. Had I just written a book about, a case where a pilot saw a UFO one day and it turned out to be a weather balloon, it would have just gone by the by. It wouldn't have been noticed. But I think it is because, Roswell is like the key card in the deck, so to speak, or it's perceived as being. And yeah, the response was everything, as I said earlier, from, turncoat, skeptic, debunker, man in black, paid off government disinformation artist, driving a Ferrari in a 50-bedroom house or something ridiculous. That, and I say, well, where is it? Yeah, that's right. It's all in a hidden bank account in Switzerland or the Cayman Islands.
It really took a lot of courage, and you do have to follow
where
things go.
Well, the thing is, the way I look at it is that the worst thing we can do is just get stuck in belief systems of, I think it's this or I think it's that. It doesn't mean it's wrong, but my view is that whatever the truth is at the heart of the UFO subject, we should investigate it to the best of our ability. We shouldn't just investigate those things that we want to hear, because that's kind of like a weak-willed approach. It's like, please let this be the answer. That, to me, that's the wrong way of investigating the UFO subject. You should investigate it just to see where it goes and what the answer is, not investigate it because you have a preconceived belief. Now, that certainly doesn't apply, as far as I'm concerned, to most, if not all, of the UFO researchers who've deeply investigated Roswell. I think people like Stan, they come to the conclusion it's extraterrestrial because they've investigated the evidence and they're firmly convinced it points in that direction. But some people do have an emotional angle to it where it's like, don't upset the apple cart. Yeah, and I think that's never been my approach. Has always been we've got to just dig for the answers, and if it's bad news, it's bad news. If it's good news, it's good news. And I think right now it's stalemate. I just don't know where it will lead or if it will lead anywhere. I mean, one of the things I often point out to people is I kind of like to, coming from England, I kind of like to draw the analogy between Roswell and the story of Jack the Ripper. And that might sound strange, but in England, Jack the Ripper is like this big mystery, and it's a fascination. You can go on tours of where he killed all these women around these little foggy streets in London. You can still do that today, and the streets still look exactly the same. You can go on these tours in the same way that you can go out to the Roswell crash site tours and things like that. And people love Jack the Ripper because it's still a mystery, and you can go around these little foggy streets and things like that. And out here, Roswell's a mystery, and you've got these huge desert plains. But people love it because Jack the Ripper's still a mystery. If he was just found to be some deranged guy who went out one night, got drunk, and killed a few people, it wouldn't matter. Well, I mean, it would matter to the victims, but it wouldn't matter in terms of it being a historical, sensational mystery. And I think that's the situation that we're faced with Roswell, is that it's such an intriguing story and it's taken on a life of its own. It really is not just an industry, but it's become, I won't say religion, but I mean, because that's the wrong word, but I mean in terms of significance to a lot of people, it's a way of life. And I think we need to get away from that and just look at it as an incident that may or may not be UFO related, and just look at it from that specific angle and aspect. And, whatever happens from now on happens, and wherever the ball falls is where the ball falls.
Nick?
Yeah.
I'm just kind of curious, as far as this obviously could be another scenario, another way that could explain, what happened. Are you exploring individuals that could still be alive today that actually could corroborate this?
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that, if you go back 60 years, which is how long ago it is now, most of the people who are in the intelligence world then, they're not going to be like the guys at Roswell who will say, 2025, you'll report and you'll go out in the desert and you'll, work on this, recovering all this material evidence, etc. The guys who were actually working at the Roswell base, who went out there, stood guard and collected debris, etc., they were young guys. But the guys who were in the intelligence world at that time, who were the ones pulling the strings, probably mid-30s, 40s, because that's the sort of experience they'd need to get up the chain of command to hold that position. So just through the passage of time, those people are now dead, obviously. But that's why the people who I interviewed were ones who were sort of around in the 50s and in one case the 60s, coming up, they said, with these fake stories. So they're a little bit younger. And I think that's the problem, is that we're not going to find now people from 47 who were in their 40s or 30s orchestrating the cover-up. They're gone. We've got the younger characters who are in the 20s or whatever, and even they're 82, 83 now. So that is, I mean, I'll be the first to admit that's the problem, is in terms of tracking down the people, if this is a true story, who were actually involved back then, rather than, as I said, the ones I interviewed who were involved 10 years later in trying to put these cover-up stories into place when the Russians began snooping. So, and that's again the problem with a lot of these incidents. And again, I draw the analogy with Jack the Ripper. There's no one to interview; they're all gone. There's no files, but there's hints of a cover-up and things like that. But how do you take it to that next step? And I'll be the first to admit I don't know. I can just put the information out and hope somebody says yes or no.
Actually, we got back here.
Okay. And then down at the front.
Yes.
Okay.
Hello. I just wondered if you were familiar with a book called Silent Siege about the Fugo balloons. If not, I don't remember the author, but I could probably find that for you.
Yeah, I am actually. I know that. There's been a couple of good books written about the Fugo balloons, and as I said, every so often people still find the old rusted balloons, sort of the rusted bombs in the woods in Oregon and things like that. And literally, as I said, hundreds have reached the US, but just didn't really do the psychological damage that the Japanese wanted to do because the press wouldn't report on it. So it's an interesting little part of wartime history. Yeah. Oh, just got a lady at the front. She was just... Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah, Nick, are you aware of the new information that just came out about Walter Haut here in Roswell?
Yeah. Walter Haut was the press information officer at the Roswell Army Airfield at the time, and issued the press release based on the words of his superior. Put this press release out, which he did, and an affidavit has come out from. Signed by Walter that was obviously prepared before his death and has just now been published in a book called Witness to Roswell by Don Schmidt and Tom Carey, which is actually a very interesting book. I read it the other day and it's got a lot of new information, and anybody who's interested in Roswell, I'd urge them to read the book. It obviously takes the pro-ET angle. And basically the scenario in the affidavit is that Walter said that he saw two bodies in one of the hangars at Roswell and saw them from a distance. The affidavit actually says that he didn't see any detail, but he said they were short and had enlarged heads. No disrespect. That's a short person with an enlarged head who I can prove was the subject of a radiation experiment at Oak Ridge in the summer of 1947. I can prove that. I've got the documents through the Freedom of Information Act. Now, that doesn't take away from what Walter said. Just because somebody was the subject of a radiation experiment at Oak Ridge in the summer of 47 and they had a small body and an enlarged bald head doesn't mean that an alien with an enlarged bald head and a dwarfish body wasn't found at Roswell also. But, to look at the time frame and everything else, we need to look at every angle. Now, this doesn't in any way, shape or form, I want to stress this, mean that any of the Roswell witnesses were lying. I don't actually think any of them were. I think what it comes down to is interpretation of what you may be seeing in the desert. You see a body found 2 days afterwards. You find the remains of that or that. Surrounded by a whole bunch of balloon debris. What does that mean? Does it mean people are lying? No, it doesn't, and I don't think they are. But, it's open to interpretation how you view what it is you're actually seeing. Are you seeing something extraterrestrial? Are you seeing something else, but are you perceiving it in a different way? And I just don't know. But, I would urge people to read the book because Walter, because of his historical background in the story, he's a major player, and to have this affidavit attached to his name is a significant angle to the story. And certainly for people who believe aliens crashed at Roswell, it's a significant aspect of that story as well. So, I don't shy away from saying to people, read it. It's a very interesting affidavit. So.
Well, but you dismiss it rather cavalier.
Sorry?
You dismiss what that affidavit says.
No, I didn't dismiss what it said. What I said was that what actually Walter says is that he saw two bodies at a distance that were short and had enlarged bald heads.
Well, obviously you haven't read the whole book. Because he handled material, he saw the craft.
Yes. But
so, this is a head, a person that's above reproach as far as I'm concerned.
No, I agree with you. No, that's
why you're just dismissing him like, well, he's just another researcher.
Did I not just say that I don't think he's lying? Did I not just say that? Yes. Thank you. What I said was that Walter says in his affidavit he saw two small bodies with enlarged heads at a distance and did not see any detail. That is the exact wording in the affidavit. Now, aliens may have crashed at Roswell with, dwarfish bodies and enlarged heads. As I said, I have the files now. You only came in towards the end of the lecture. I have the files now showing that people with progeria, this condition that's on screen now, were the subject of radiation experiments at Oak Ridge, Tennessee in the summer of 47. I've got the files through the Freedom of Information Act. Doesn't necessarily have a bearing on Roswell. And so that you know, and I'm emphasising this, I do not believe any of the Roswell witnesses who said they saw bodies or an unusual vehicle, like maybe that, or maybe like that, were lying. I don't think any of them were lying. What I'm merely bringing up is the issue of the interpretation of what it is they were seeing. That's all. You know, it's like, were they seeing aliens or were they not? But it's human nature, how you interpret things. You know, Walter said he saw two bodies at a distance and couldn't make out any details. To his credit, that's not actually, you know, trying to say, to go into, you know, complete detail. He's just saying, I saw something at a distance. So, you know, again, but it's an interesting affidavit, but that's my view. You know, none of the people are lying. It's just interpretation of what they're looking at. So. Oh, yeah.
Had we had a balloon like the Fugo that you showed there that was in the office of the PR persons at Walker Air Force Base, we wouldn't have even have a Roswell incident. The balloon they had there was strictly a nothing kind of thing.
Oh, yeah.
But that one was certainly something that would have been suspect by the persons who found it. And I find it unfortunate that if we have a government cover-up, which we apparently do have to a degree at any rate, that the balloon that was found there is one that was not something that was weird, you know, and certainly it did not fit any of the ideas of what went on out there. And also the fact that you might be more credible if you would do a devil's advocate and support the Roswell incident sometime and see what all you can find that, in your opinion, denies what you have said to us today, and says, oh, you know, support the Roswell just for fun, just to see, just for fun, to give you a project, but be the devil's advocate, and perhaps that would be an interesting thing for you and for us.
Well, you know, no, actually, I agree with you. I mean, I'm probably different to a lot of people in the UFO subject because I want to know the truth about Roswell. You know, I want to know what the answer is, but I don't need it to be this or that, personally, from an emotional belief system angle. You know, if something surfaces tomorrow and Roswell was proven to be alien, I will stand up and say, these guys deceived me, or their bosses deceived me. You know, I actually have there's no personal advantage to me to kind of ostracize and isolate myself from the entire UFO community when I write books on UFOs, but I felt it was important to put the story out. So, yeah, so you know, I don't dispute that it could be alien, and I'm not trying to knock the UFO angle. I'm just pointing out that when you look into it, you do find 4 or 5 significant Japanese things, all linked with people who were connected in some ways with the Roswell story. Again, you know, that may mean something, it may mean nothing, it may mean everything. But, you know, I mean, I understand, you know, what we're actually doing is what we should be doing. We're debating it in a way which hopefully would actually open some doors instead of somebody just saying, you're an idiot, no, you're an idiot, which is, well, that's ufology. So. You know, it actually is better if you can, you know, sit and debate something and try and come to a conclusion and examine the evidence. And, you know, it's like the Walter Haut's affidavit. That is really interesting what he says in there. But it's how you interpret it, how you interpret the evidence. You know, I don't dispute the UFO angle. You know, I was a strong believer in it for years, and I don't deny it now. I just think it's the right thing. I think the right thing to do is to address all the evidence. Okay. Who? Okay.
Well, I had a question before I hand the microphone over because I had my hand up.
Where
Nick,
are we?
I'm here.
Oh, okay. I'm dazzled.
I was going to ask you about if strawberry jam is cold.
Yeah.
No. What, in reference to what this lady up here said, what is the best evidence to you that from a proponent that you don't have all the answers to this question, such as maybe unbreakable or unrippable fabric, etc.?
Yeah, that's the one angle of Roswell that isn't explainable by really any other idea than the UFO theory, is the memory metal. Now, you know, it's like if you've got a balloon's a balloon. If you've got a large balloon, it's still a large balloon. If you've got an unusual body, it could be human or not. But, you know, the memory metal angle is the one that, you know, I have no answers for. It is one that is supportive of the UFO angle. It's not supportive of, you know, even a jet plane crashing or anything like that. And that's the one where I think, you know, if I was going to say that if there's one thing that would knock the theory down, it would be specifically and only that one where there isn't kind of like a grey area. No pun intended.
So no theory answers everything.
What's that?
This woman was next, and then this gentleman.
Okay.
Yeah, I had a comment and a question. Unfortunately, I don't debate or dispute anything you say. I don't dispute anything you say, but I think the unfortunate thing about this story, it's going to be the boards and the rope, what was to crop circles.
The what, sorry?
It's going to be skeptic's paradise, in as much as they're going to jump on this and say, see, that's what it was.
Well,
just
you know,
like,
I mean...
like I said, the guys that admitted they made the crop circles, you know, with the boards and ropes, did the crop circles.
Well,
Everybody remembers the guy admitted,
yeah,
you know,
I remember.
making it.
Yeah. I would actually disagree with you, being the author, that, you know, the response that came from the book was that there actually wasn't that much of a response outside of the tightly knit UFO research community. You know, it wasn't something that was splashed over the New York Times or the Washington Post, you know, or CNN or Larry King or anything like that. It was something primarily discussed on UFO internet discussion lists or reviewed in UFO magazine or Fate magazine. You know, it didn't reach to epidemic proportions or anything like that. So, you know, certainly nowhere near, you know, when the Air Force came out with its mogul balloon theory and the crash test dummies, that was sort of all over the newspapers. You know, my book sells predominantly to the few thousand people that make up the UFO research community. You know, that's actually one of the things that a lot of people...
But I think that would have that effect if it ever got...
Oh, yeah, I mean, if it had done that, but I mean, you know, I don't actually have the book with me, but I mean, I pointed out in the book where the people had told me things, where I found what they said, some of the things they told me problematic, or where they were evasive in their answers. You know, I didn't shy away from saying that in the book, because I don't, you know, if they say something to me and they're not prepared to go the full way, it's my responsibility to tell people that, you know, there were certain things they were evasive on. But, you know, again, the thing that makes Roswell, I guess in one sense a good case, if that's the right word, is that it's not possible to prove this theory any more than the Air Force couldn't even prove that crash test dummies were found. So, you know, there's no way to disprove the ET angle because we don't have a smoking gun that proves any of the other theories. You know, the Air Force didn't even find one mogul document to support its theory that a mogul balloon crashed or that crash test dummies were found. They found nothing. That's by their own admission. That was just their best guess as to what they think happened. But, you know, the mainstream media picked up on that. And I think both of those stories are just outright lies. I don't, you know, think there's a grain of truth to those theories at all. But... You know, I do agree with you that the skeptics would have picked right up on it. But my view in the book wasn't to debunk Roswell. It was basically in a written form to tell you, or the reader, in the same fashion I've told you now, tonight, you know, related what I found out and what I'd found out was going on in that time period. You know, it wasn't a case of me saying, you know, I started off as a UFO researcher and everybody's nuts for believing this story because I've got the answer. The book's not written anything like that. It's just a case of me interviewing these people, relating what they said and trying to determine if they're speaking truthfully or not. So.
Yeah,
and maybe that's why it wasn't picked up by the skeptics. I don't know.
My main thing about the... Sorry? Oh, I know, but I said I had a question and a comment. The memory metal has always been my biggest...
The what,
thing.
sorry?
The memory metal.
Yeah.
Has always been my biggest...
Yeah, the memory metal
ones.
ones.
As much as it could be something otherworldly, if you like. If we had that 60 years ago?
No,
Is it
I
not
fully
in
agree with you.
commercial use, you know?
Yeah, I fully agree with the memory metal is one of the most
biggest
important
thing.
aspects of the story. Yeah.
The question I had was, you'd mentioned that this is the scenario could be a cover-up for the weather, the experiments of the balloons and the Japanese. The newspaper headline said, Air Force finds flying disc, captures flying disc. So then here they are coming out with a story about the UFOs, right, covering up the balloons. So then the next day, they reverse their story and say, oh, no, it wasn't UFOs. It was a balloon. So why would they do that based on your theory?
Well, basically, what they said was they captured a flying disc and then changed that story to a weather balloon. Now, a weather balloon is just, a small device sent aloft to detect the weather. That's a big difference between, the Air Force's mogul balloon that they said was the cover story, or the idea of a huge Zeppelin-type balloon array with a fixed-wing aircraft beneath it. It wasn't a case. The story I got, as far as why the press release was put out of the story I got, and again, bear in mind this is simply what I was told, was that had the military got to the site first, then there would have been no need for a press release because the military would have recovered it all and it would all have been held in secrecy. That I was told the reason the press release was put out was because the worst case scenario that could have happened did happen when Rancher Matt Brazel actually stumbled upon the material before the military got there. And he went into town, and then in other words, a civilian, a member of the public, got hold of this classified story before the military could contain it. And so when he went into town, began to be interviewed, then the military thought, well, we've got to do some damage control. So it was a flying disc, and then they knocked that down with a weather balloon. That's 40 years later, they knocked that down with a mogul balloon. And then for years, they denied there were any bodies. And then they said, well, yeah, there were bodies, but they were crash test dummies. Regardless of what the theory or the truth is, I think it all comes down to that there's been a lot of deliberate confusion. And I'll be the first to admit I don't know the ins and outs of how we go about explaining, why 60 years ago somebody said, let's first say it was a flying disc, then say it's a weather balloon. Why not just say it was a weather balloon? That is, again, one of the odd aspects of the story. Again, all we can do, I don't like to try and guess and, make too many, sort of hypothesize too much, because we just don't have the benefit of the facts beyond the fact that the government's changed its story more times than I change my socks or something like that.
In regards to...
where are we?
Yeah, in regards to your comments about this nurse who said these beings had Oriental look to them, is this the same nurse that made the sketches?
No, she was at Roswell. This was a nurse at Oak Ridge at Tennessee, the atomic energy installation at Tennessee. And she was actually she wasn't like a military nurse. She was actually trained in the field of radiation effects on the human body. That was her background. Bear in mind, this was sort of in its infancy at that time. This was 45 to 49. I think I'd have to check the notes properly, but I think it was 45 to 49 she was there, or possibly 50. And it was, so she was specifically trained in this one specific area. But I mean, there are a lot of military people who've spoken about Roswell and seemingly had knowledge about the case and were stationed at different places, as if, and this could apply to the ET angle as well, some material was taken here, one body was taken there, something else was taken here. So it's not surprising, there are different people from different areas coming forward with different stories that collectively come together. Yeah?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think a lot of people in the UFO community, that they tend to neglect that there are historical facts out there that this country has had a long history of experimenting on people, from syphilis experiments to putting mercury in kids' milk, to even testing bacteria in New York subways just to track how far it goes across the country in case somebody let off bacteria. And with that in mind, I think a lot of people just don't think about that, and I think it's commendable that you're using historical references and that this is completely possible, especially seeing what we know since the 90s of what the government's done.
Yeah, I mean, that is the thing I always say to people is don't look at Roswell as an isolated incident. Look at it as, maybe something that was in the context of maybe 6 or 7 experiments. I mean, one of the things that a lot of people, and I think this is significant, a lot of people maybe just don't even think about it as having any significance. One of the things that happened in the mid-1990s was when the General Accounting Office was doing its investigation of Roswell to try and determine what had happened, they found that all the outgoing messages from Roswell Army Air Force Base from 46 through 49, I think it was, had vanished. They were just gone. Now, people have said, well, that proves, the government went in, whipped all the files out and, destroyed them or hid them in a secure hangar or vault somewhere so no one would ever get their hands on them, which isn't, that's entirely plausible. That would be, an adequate way of hiding the fact that aliens did crash. But one of the things that I point out in the book is that, if that is the case, if the Roswell incident was just a random event that happened in July 47, why destroy files dated back till 1946? That suggests to me that if the files from 47 were destroyed, they were part of an ongoing thing that had its origins in 46, that suddenly appeared, appeared out of nowhere in early July 47. If this was something, a random event, rather than a series of experiments, why not just pull the files from the start of July? Why go back a full 12 months? May not have any significance. It may be in a panic, somebody just grabbed everything. On the other hand, it could be relevant. It's just, it is so difficult to know, but the historical angle of what else was going on, for me at least, is an important one. So. Did you have a question?
Yeah. The AEC was given the responsibility for genetic research and so forth, and basically given responsibility for the Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors. I don't know when they were given that responsibility. I don't know who had it before, but of course Alamogordo is like AEC Central at this time. Yeah. So there is that Japanese connection. Do you know anything about this responsibility with respect to do you know anything about this responsibility with respect to the Japanese, et cetera, and all of this?
Not really. Other than that, I just find it intriguing that there are, as you said, these links, and also the fact that the atomic bomb drops on Japan were actually launched from Roswell. It's that's not related to the Roswell incident, but it's another time. But I'm not actually sure of the context and timeline of that AEC thing with the survivors of the bomb blasts.
Yeah, because there is that Japanese connection between, New Mexico and right next door, between them and the Japanese.
Yeah.
Back to the Japanese, have you heard any accounts or rumors of survivors of these tests you were talking about?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the guys I interviewed said that they did recall where 1 or 2 had survived and they were placed in, an asylum or a care home, that sort of thing, a secure hospital afterwards. The thing that I was told as far as the people who were used, there were sort of 6 or 7 experiments, all high altitude experiments, or these hybrid type devices, balloons with detachable aircraft that just crashed, and the people were just killed, as they would be in a normal aircraft. But I think I'd have to check the notes, but I think there were references to like 2 or 3 that may have survived and were just taken to a secure medical facility to live out whatever was left of the days. And but again, it's one of those things where, unfortunately, I can't elaborate on it purely because I just don't know. I wish I could say to you black and white, this is what happened, or there were survivors and they were taken there. We're dealing with sort of people in their 80s recalling files they read in the 50s and 60s and trying to, get that right in their memory and tell me. And then, were they told the full story from the files? It's, it is one of these things like Chinese whispers, the story starts at one thing and gets distorted as it goes along, so.
Well, the reason I asked was, like the best account of the Holocaust comes from
Oh,
Jews,
you mean like
not Germans.
people who could come forward afterwards and testify, that sort of thing?
Right, the victims.
Oh, yeah, no, I never came across anything like that. No.
Second question off the wall. What was the name of the restaurant on the road to Waco?
I'd rather not sort of go.
That was curious.
Yeah, it was a Mexican restaurant, sort of about 15 miles outside of Waco.
Okay.
There actually was there's an interesting reason why I prefer not to mention the name. It's all to do with the legal departments of the publishers and things like that. So, it's all in connection with taping the conversations, and it's sort of bizarre, sort of legal aspect. But the follow-up ones were sort of just done by telephone. It was just some of the initial ones that were done in person, like the lady in Los Angeles. That was in a Denny's, by the way. That was nothing strange about that. It was just in a Denny's, and I think I had like a ham sandwich or something and a Coke. I don't know. So nothing exciting about it. No sort of midnight meeting or anything like that. So.
Anything else?
Thanks. Thanks. I think it's probably been banned or something by now.
Not available
Not available anywhere. I've actually sold out mine, but I mean you can get it Amazon, yeah, or Barnes and Noble and things like that. You don't have any? No, they've all gone, unfortunately. No. There might be one or two booksellers that might have copies. There's an old couple. They've got a big bookstore.
UFO-tree things going on in the workshop room, if anybody's interested. I think they just took off.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Oh, cool. Thanks. Thanks.
A couple of my friends were actually we were drinking in like 1999 in college, and we were discussing a similar theory.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, it is one of these things where. And I was talking to Michael earlier. I think one of the problems with Roswell is that it's one of these make or break cases where if it's proven to be extraterrestrial, then the game's over and we know the truth. But I think the problem with Roswell is that it's been built up, particularly by the media, but also by the UFO research community, as the one case that will answer the question. And in one respect that's true, but on the other hand, it's almost like if Roswell collapses, then the extraterrestrial hypothesis for the UFO subject, or indeed, the idea that there's an unexplained angle to it, that collapses as well. And that shouldn't actually be the case. If you look at, for example, the collective body of information that we have in hand on UFO reports from the mid-40s onwards to the present day, there's a significant body of reports, literally thousands, radar cases, visual cases, pilot reports, police reports, members of the public, official documents from the CIA, FBI, National Security Agency, which, when you combine them, convincingly, for me at least, show that something strange is flying around our skies. And I certainly don't believe the vast majority of the unexplained ones are some sort of classified government technology. I think we do have some sort of unknown presence amongst us. I'm just, not prepared to say it's from planet A or it's from star system B, because I think if we're honest with ourselves, none of us have those answers to a definitive point. So that's basically my position. But I think that, as I said, as far as Roswell's concerned, we don't need to, or we shouldn't, make that one particular case as the emphasis upon which the extraterrestrial hypothesis stands. And unfortunately, consciously or subconsciously or unconsciously, that does happen. If one case collapses, so what? There's another 3,999 that still stand the test of time. So with that little bit of background, I guess, out of the way, I'll sort of get into the body of what the book's about and how I uncovered the story and you know, do I consider it to be true? Do I consider the people I interviewed to be truthful, but were they deceived? Or is the whole thing disinformation to hide the fact that aliens really did crash at Roswell? And that's basically the theme of the lecture. Now, the story behind the book is that I interviewed a number of ex-military and intelligence people between 1996 and 2004 who broadly related from their own perspectives a story that suggested that in the New Mexico desert in the summer of 1947, a number of experiments and test flights were undertaken on prototype aircraft which had guinea pig crews on board, if crew is the right word. Some of these were high-altitude balloon experiments to try and determine the effects of high-altitude exposure on the human body, which actually wasn't that well understood at that particular time in history. Other ones were prototype flights of radically designed aircraft, swept-wing aircraft, half-moon type vehicles. And the story I got was that a number of these tests, experiments were undertaken. Pretty much all of them didn't really work that well. They crashed, the crews were killed, the bodies were recovered, and the whole thing was hidden behind a UFO smokescreen. That's, in a nutshell, the story. It actually goes back to 1996 for me, but the beginnings of it, in recent years at least, go back to 1991. And one of the things I'm going to mention tonight is certain things that aren't in the book. The way the publisher wanted me to write the book was not from a personal perspective. They just wanted the text of the interviews with the people that I'd done, transcribing the tapes and the interview notes, etc., and me present that for the reader, which I had no problem with. But they didn't want it from a sort of personal first-hand perspective of how I got the information, which I think, had that been included, that might have kind of, I won't say convince people more, that's the wrong word, but I think it would have made people realise why I continue to pursue this story. Well, as everybody knows, you know, there have been countless witnesses to Roswell have come forward throughout the years, pretty much going back to Jesse Marcel Sr., Major Marcel, who pretty much was responsible for breaking the story in the modern era when he was tracked down by Stanton Friedman. And then people like Bill Moore and Charles Berlitz wrote the Roswell incident, and then Kevin Randall and Don Schmitt followed that up. And, you know, subsequently to where now, I think there's probably been somewhere in the region of about 20 books published on Roswell. Well, in 1991, a British author named Timothy Good published a book called Alien Liaison. And Alien Liaison included the testimony of a man who was stationed at Roswell named Melvin Brown. And Brown said that he'd seen some of the bodies that had been recovered from the New Mexico desert in the summer of 1947. And his exact words were that they could have passed for Chinese. Now, this, at the time, didn't really, it wasn't a matter of any.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us here in Roswell. Our next speaker is UK-born Nick Redfern. He is the author of several important and well-known books in the field of ufology, including Strange Secrets, A Covert Agenda, and Cosmic Crashes, all books documenting government records of UFO activity. He has worked as a freelance journalist for the London Daily Express and is a feature writer for the London-based People, and too many newsstand publications within the UK to name here. Most recently, he writes for UFO Magazine and just completed publication of his newest book, Celebrity Secrets, detailing FBI surveillance files on many of Hollywood's best-known personalities. Recently, however, he also authored Body Snatchers in the Desert, The Horrible Truth Behind the Roswell Incident, and On the Trail of the Saucer Spies, which documents government surveillance of people within the field of ufology. Today he shares with us, perhaps, the most amazing and, if true, quite grisly alternative explanation of what might really have happened in Roswell of 1947. Please welcome Nick Redfern.
I'll pay you for that nice introduction later. Well, thanks everybody. I guess we've heard a lot of good speakers so far, but I guess for every good guy you have to have the bad guy, and for this conference I guess the bad guy is me. And as Lisa said, what I'm going to be speaking about is my book, Body Snatchers in the Desert, if I can get rid of that security sensor thing. And as Lisa briefly said, Body Snatchers in the Desert is based around Roswell, but it looks at the case, if you like, the incident, the aftermath, the whole history of it from a completely different perspective. That being, is it possible that yes, some sort of unconventional vehicle or vehicles crashed, bodies were recovered, but they were distinctly not alien? Now, I guess from the UFO community's perspective at least, when the book was published in June 2005, all hell metaphorically broke loose in terms of, how could this man dare say this about this one particular case that, is the holy grail, if you like, of ufology. And, I've seen a lot of things where I've been painted as not just a skeptic, but an outright debunker, or the worst thing from, a combination of Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. And almost, shall we say. Not quite, but it was almost down that path, shall we say. Which is actually quite far from the case. And as I've got sort of 90 minutes rather than the normal hour that I do on this lecture normally, I sort of share a bit of background with you on not just the story, but how I came to uncover the story and the basic bones of it. As far as my ufological beliefs are concerned, if you like, at a collective level, I'm not a skeptic, I'm not a debunker. The reason I got interested and how I got interested is that my father served in the British Royal Air Force and worked on radar. In the early 1950s, he was stationed at a base in the east coast of England called RAF Neatishead. And he was on duty one night in the early hours of the morning, tracking these weird objects flying from the former Soviet Union, or the region of the former Soviet Union. And of course, the first thought was this was some sort of sneak Russian attack. And aircraft were scrambled from a nearby Air Force base. Pilots reported seeing these weird glowing lights in the sky, didn't know what they were. The pilots were ordered to try and close in on them. And the objects actually slowed down and allowed the aircraft to close in. And it was almost like a game of cat and mouse was being played between the air crews and the UFOs. And this went on literally over the course of about 3 nights. And eventually everybody involved in the incident was taken into a room, sworn to secrecy, reminded of the fact that they'd signed the British government's Official Secrets Act, and told, you won't talk to your family, friends, and you certainly won't talk to the media about this incident. And my father did keep quiet about this and didn't relate the facts to anybody until roughly around, I think, 1978, 79, when he told me. And that's what really got my interest. And of course, when you hear something like this from a family member, a story of sort of profound significance from someone who's trained to know what goes on in our skies, that really opened my eyes to the fact that, yes, strange things are out there. So, I'm certainly not a UFO skeptic, significant, shall we say. A number of people have said that the bodies found at Roswell had sort of slanted eyes or oriental eyes. So that kind of tied in there. But the fact that he specifically said they could have passed for Chinese, that was sort of another angle. It almost sounded like, passing for Chinese was almost identical. Coincidentally or not, in the same year, 1991, an American researcher named Leonard Stringfield published a status report. He put out these regular status reports on his research into crashed UFOs, which he began in 1978, and his last one was in 1994, the year that he died. And in his 1991 report, he put out a story, or a number of stories, included in the book, from a researcher named Timothy Cooper. And Tim Cooper was one of the early researchers of the Majestic 12 documents, these leaked whistleblower documents that suggest aliens did crash at Roswell, and that this clandestine group called Majestic 12 was established to deal with the crash and the aftermath and autopsies of the alien bodies, etc. Well, one of the stories that Cooper got hold of and that Stringfield published in 1991 was a story from a nurse who worked at Los Alamos in the summer of 1947. And she had told Cooper, indirectly or directly, we're not sure if there was an intermediary between Cooper and the nurse. That's still a bit of a grey area. But the gist of the story was that the nurse worked at Los Alamos, and she was aware of, I think, between 1945 and 1947, a number of strange-looking bodies having been brought into Los Alamos. And the rumour mill that was going around Los Alamos, it was that they were deformed, handicapped people brought in from Japan at the end of the Second World War for use in early radiation experiments at Los Alamos. So you have two strands of what could be one story. You have Melvin Brown in Timothy Good's book talking about how he'd seen these bodies at Roswell that could have passed for Chinese people. Then you have Timothy Cooper's nurse talking about seeing these deformed bodies at Los Alamos that were rumoured to be Japanese people used in radiation experiments. Now, again, that's just two stories. You know, there's nothing to tie those in. Well, then in 1997, Popular Mechanics, which is a well-known newsstand magazine, published a story. Now, I'm sure a lot of you who have followed the Roswell story will know the angle that surfaced in 1997 from the US Air Force when they announced that the stories about so-called alien bodies being found at Roswell were just crash test dummies used in high-altitude parachuting.